Olivia crossed the gleaming hardwood floor of Westfield High's elite athletic training facility. Her temporary ID badge dangled from a cheap lanyard. The word "substitute" printed in bold red letters that felt like a scarlet letter against her. Plain gray athletic wear. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Olympic-sized swimming pool where tomorrow's champions trained, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation from last week that had turned her world upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Temporary placement only, Principal Donovan had said, not even looking up from his laptop. Effective immediately. You'll be filling in for Coach Miller while he recovers. Observation and basic supervision only. Observation only. The words still stung like chlorine in an open wound. After 12 years as an Olympic-level swimming coach, after everything she'd sacrificed, she was being shuffled into a babysitting role disguised as coaching. The official reason was budget constraints and her lack of teaching credentials, but Olivia knew the real story. Her last position had imploded, not because of anything she'd done wrong, but because someone higher up needed a scapegoat. Politics. And blame had a way of splashing onto whoever was standing closest, and she'd been treading water in the deep end. The state-of-the-art training facility stretched before her like an alien landscape. All gleaming equipment and perfectly regulated water temperature that seemed to amplify sound and crush hope in equal measure. This was where the elite swimmers came to prove themselves, where careers were made or broken based on split-second decisions and millisecond improvements. Olivia had once belonged here, had earned her place through sweat, early mornings, and countless hours perfecting her training methods. Now she was just furniture. The pool deck was already buzzing with activity despite the early hour. Voices echoed across the natatorium, mostly confident, mostly discussing their latest times and betting on who could outswim whom in the day's trials. Olivia recognized some of the faces from previous competitions, but they looked right through her now, with her substitute badge, without her coaching credentials, without any visible authority markers. She might as well have been invisible. She found her assigned station near the equipment room, a metal folding chair with a weathered clipboard that provided maybe 3 square feet of personal space. Her job description was simple: observe and document, record attendance, note equipment usage, maintain safety protocols. Glorified babysitting dressed up with educational terminology. Assistant coach James Preston approached her chair with the kind of swagger that came from knowing everyone was watching. He was one of the facility's top coaches, a man whose reputation was built on making difficult techniques look effortless and making weaker swimmers feel inadequate. His eyes swept over Olivia's substitute badge and clipboard with obvious dismissal. "You the new sub?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Make sure you stay clear of lanes 1 through 4 during advanced training. We've got serious athletes to develop here." Olivia nodded politely, swallowing the urge to remind him that she'd probably logged more pool time than half his students combined. Instead, she clicked her pen and prepared to document whatever testosterone-fueled competition was about to unfold. The morning progressed exactly as she'd expected. Swimmers lined up to demonstrate their skills, each trying to outdo the last. Times were compared loudly. Voices grew louder as the morning wore on. Olivia dutifully recorded attendance, water, temperature readings, and equipment usage, all while feeling like a ghost haunting her former life. It was during the water break that she overheard the conversation that would change everything. "Did you see the new pencil pusher?" one of the younger swimmers was saying to his buddy. "Administration must be scraping the bottom of the barrel for subs these days." "I heard she's some kind of washout," another voice chimed in. "Probably. Couldn't handle the pressure of real coaching." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, the kind that sliced deeper than any physical wound. Olivia kept her eyes on her paperwork, her pen moving steadily across the page, but her jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. These kids had no idea who she was, what she'd accomplished, or what she'd sacrificed. To them, she was just another anonymous face in the support staff, unworthy of their respect or recognition. But what hurt most wasn't their dismissal. It was the grain of truth in their mockery. She was a washout in a sense. Not because she couldn't handle the pressure, but because she'd been thrown under the bus by people who valued politics over performance. The medals her swimmers had won didn't matter. The careers she'd launched were forgotten. All that remained was this: a clipboard and a folding chair beside an Olympic-sized pool. As the afternoon session began, Olivia noticed something that made her stomach tighten with anticipation. The swimmers were setting up for advanced technique trials, using underwater cameras positioned at strategic points to analyze their form. This was serious business, the kind of challenge that separated the truly skilled from the merely competent. She watched them prepare with practiced efficiency, expensive tech suits, specialized goggles, heart rate monitors, and performance tracking devices. Everything was precise, calculated, professional. These were good swimmers, some of them excellent. But as Olivia observed their techniques, old instincts began to stir. She found herself analyzing stroke patterns without conscious thought, noting the subtle inefficiencies in their movements that were costing precious hundreds of seconds. Her eyes tracked body positions and breathing patterns, calculating adjustments that would maximize efficiency and reduce drag. It was muscle memory, mental conditioning that years of training had burned into her brain. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The familiar ache of longing settled in her chest like a physical weight. This was her world, her language, her calling, and she was trapped on the sidelines, reduced to watching others do what she'd once done better than almost anyone else in the country. As the day wore on, the competitive atmosphere grew more intense. Times were recorded with increasing excitement. Voices echoed farther as egos inflated with each successful sprint. Olivia continued her documentation, invisible and ignored, while inside her, the fire that had made her legendary began to smolder with renewed heat. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring an opportunity that would change everything. Tomorrow they would hand her a stopwatch as a joke, never imagining that they were about to awaken something they weren't prepared to face. The second day dawned bright and clear, with the kind of perfect light that made the pool water sparkle like diamonds and turned the metal starting blocks into reflective beacons. Olivia arrived at her station early, hoping to avoid the worst of the morning rush. But knowing that her plastic chair and flimsy clipboard offered little protection against the high school's social hierarchy, the facility was already active. When she settled in with her papers and travel mug of coffee, today's session promised to be special. Word had spread about a visiting team of competitive swimmers from Riverside Academy who'd come to test their skills against the local talent. The usual posturing had reached new levels of intensity. Olivia watched the newcomers arrive with professional interest. They moved with the fluid confidence of athletes who'd seen real competition, their equipment bags bearing the scuffs and patches that came from actual travel rather than just local meets. Their coach, a lean woman with prematurely silver hair and eyes like Arctic ice, supervised their warm-up with quiet authority. "That's Coach Elizabeth Morgan," she heard someone whisper nearby. 3 Olympic qualifiers trained by her. National championships in double digits. Woman's a legend. Olivia recognized the type immediately. The kind of coach who let her swimmers' times do the talking. She'd worked alongside coaches like Morgan before, back when she'd worn different credentials and carried different responsibilities. The recognition brought another sharp pang of loss, quickly suppressed. Assistant Coach Preston was clearly feeling the pressure of the visiting competition. His usual cocky demeanor had taken on a harder edge, and he was barking orders at his students with less patience than usual. Olivia noticed him glancing repeatedly at Morgan's team, sizing them up like a prize fighter studying his opponent. "All right, listen up," Preston announced to the assembled swimmers. "We've got guests today, and I don't intend to embarrass this facility. I want to see your absolute best work out there. No excuses, no second chances." The morning progressed with escalating displays of technique. Turns were executed with increasing precision. Environmental conditions were monitored with obsessive attention, and each successful swim was celebrated like a minor victory. Olivia dutifully recorded it all, her pen scratching across forms that would be filed away and forgotten. It was during a brief equipment check that Morgan approached her table. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around her eyes, the kind that came from squinting through chlorine-filled air in hostile competitive environments. Her gaze was direct but not unkind as she looked at Olivia's clipboard and substitute badge. "How long have you been working substitute duty?" she asked, her voice carrying just a hint of New England sharpness. "This is my second day," Olivia replied honestly. Morgan nodded slowly, her eyes studying Olivia's face with the careful attention of someone trained to read people. "Mind if I ask what you did before this assignment?" The question caught Olivia off guard. Most people assumed she'd always been support staff, that this was the extent of her professional experience. She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "Various duties," she said finally. "Standard coaching rotations." Something flickered in Morgan's expression, a flash of recognition or suspicion that was gone too quickly to interpret. She started to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she nodded politely and moved away, leaving Olivia with the uncomfortable feeling that she'd seen more than was intended. The afternoon brought the main event, a precision swimming competition between the home team and the visitors. Times were set at national qualifying standards across multiple strokes that would challenge even experienced swimmers. The excitement reached fever pitch as swimmers from both teams prepared their equipment with ritualistic care. Olivia found herself drawn into the competition despite her observer status. Old habits died hard, and she couldn't help analyzing the swimmers' techniques, noting their strengths and weaknesses. Preston was good. Better than good, actually, but she could see the subtle signs of tension in his coaching style that suggested he was feeling the pressure. Morgan's team moved with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and precise. The heats began with methodical regularity. Each swimmer had 2 attempts at their specialty stroke, with times averaged to determine the winner. The home team started strong with several respectable performances that drew appreciative comments from the crowd. But Morgan's team answered with swims that were consistently faster, more precise. As the competition progressed, Olivia noticed something that made her frown with concern. The water temperature was shifting more dramatically than the electronic monitoring equipment was registering. The pool's unique circulation system created complex currents that the standard instruments couldn't track accurately. She'd seen similar conditions before, in places where the difference between a medal and elimination could mean the difference between a scholarship and crushing debt. Several swimmers posted times well below their potential, their performances thrown off by conditions they hadn't accounted for. The disappointments were met with frustrated muttering and equipment adjustments that wouldn't solve the real problem. Olivia watched with growing frustration as swimmer after swimmer failed to adapt properly. Preston was coaching the next athlete, and Olivia could see the strain in his face as he delivered last-minute instructions. He'd been talking a big game all day, but now the pressure was showing. His directions were slightly rushed, his focus on the wrong technical elements. These were small things, invisible to most observers, but Olivia's trained eye caught them all. The swim went poorly, missing the qualifying time by several seconds. Preston's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger as he checked and rechecked his notes, looking for some explanation for his swimmer's failure. The crowd fell silent, the earlier bravado replaced by uncomfortable tension. "Tough conditions today," Morgan observed mildly, but her tone carried an undertone that suggested she understood the real problem. That's when Preston made his mistake. Frustrated by his team's poor performance and stung by the presence of the visiting team, he looked around for someone to blame. His eyes fell on Olivia, sitting quietly at her table with her clipboard and substitute badge. "Maybe if we had proper coaching support instead of whatever this is," he said loudly, gesturing in her direction, "we'd have better performance data to work with." The comment hit Olivia like a physical blow. She'd been documenting conditions meticulously, recording every detail that her position allowed. The problem wasn't her data. It was the coach's inability to read conditions that their equipment couldn't detect, but she said nothing. She just sat there, absorbing the unjust accusation while the crowd murmured agreement. In their minds, she was the obvious scapegoat, the anonymous substitute who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of competitive swimming. Morgan was watching the exchange with sharp interest, her ice blue eyes moving between Preston and Olivia like she was solving a puzzle. When their gazes met briefly, Olivia saw something there that made her heart skip. Recognition, perhaps, or suspicion that there was more to her story than met the eye. The competition continued, but the atmosphere had soured. More swimmers posted disappointing times, more frustration built, and more sidelong glances were thrown in Olivia's direction. She was becoming the unofficial explanation for everyone's poor performance, the convenient target for their wounded pride. As the day drew to a close and equipment was packed away, Olivia overheard fragments of conversation that made her stomach knot with dread. "Completely useless substitute. Should have someone who actually understands swimming. Probably doesn't know the difference between butterfly and backstroke." The words followed her as she gathered her own materials and prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more mockery, more blame, more slow erosion of her dignity and self-worth. She was trapped in a position where she couldn't defend herself without revealing secrets that weren't hers to tell. But as she walked toward the parking area, clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield, Olivia felt something stirring deep inside her chest. It was anger, yes, but something more than that. It was the competitive fire that had made her legendary in communities these students had never heard of. The driving need to prove herself that had carried her through the darkest moments of her career. They thought she was nobody. They thought she was weak, incompetent, unworthy of their respect. Tomorrow, if the opportunity arose, she might just show them how wrong they were. The third day brought ominous changes that Olivia noticed immediately. Her folding chair had been moved farther from the pool deck, positioned behind a supply cart that blocked her view of most activities. Her request for a backup temperature monitoring device had been denied without explanation. And when she'd arrived at the faculty office to collect fresh attendance sheets, the secretary had handed them over with barely concealed contempt. "Try to get the paperwork right this time," she'd said with a smirk. "We don't need any more excuses for poor performance." The message was clear. She was being systematically isolated and blamed for problems she hadn't created. Olivia recognized the pattern from previous positions. The slow squeeze of institutional pressure designed to make unwanted personnel quit voluntarily. It was easier than formal disciplinary action and avoided uncomfortable questions about fairness or due process. But Olivia had survived worse than bureaucratic harassment. She settled into her relocated position with grim determination, prepared to document whatever fresh humiliation the day might bring. The morning session began with increased security measures that seemed specifically designed to limit her access. New permission protocols had been erected around the equipment storage area. Additional supervision checks were being conducted at random intervals. Most telling of all, a new monitoring policy required all substitute staff to remain in designated areas unless specifically authorized to move. Olivia understood the subtext perfectly. They were building a case, creating a paper trail that would justify her eventual removal from even this diminished role. Every restriction, every barrier, every small indignity was being carefully documented by someone higher up the chain of command. Assistant Coach Preston seemed particularly energized by the new arrangements. He moved through the facility with renewed swagger, his voice echoing farther as he addressed his swimmers. "That's what I'm talking about," he announced after a particularly good time. "When everyone does their job properly, excellence follows naturally." The comment was aimed directly at Olivia, delivered with enough theatrical emphasis to ensure everyone understood the intended target. Several swimmers chuckled appreciatively, enjoying the spectacle of someone else's humiliation. The visiting team from Riverside was still present, their competition having extended into a longer evaluation period. Coach Morgan continued to watch. Olivia with those ice blue eyes, her expression unreadable but somehow supportive. During a brief break in the morning session, she approached Olivia's isolated station. "Interesting setup they've got you working with," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Standard protocols," Olivia replied, not trusting herself to say more. Morgan nodded slowly, her gaze taking in the barriers and restrictions surrounding Olivia's position. "Mind if I ask you something?" Olivia looked up from her clipboard, meeting her direct stare. "That training note you recorded yesterday, the patterns you documented about Lane 4's turbulence between 2 o'clock and 3 p.m., how did you calculate those variations without direct pool access in that section?" The question hit Olivia like a lightning bolt. Lane 4 had been a blind spot for the standard monitoring equipment, an area where complex circulation features created microcurrents that couldn't be measured remotely. She'd estimated the conditions based on visual cues and experience, the kind of poolcraft that came from years of practical application. But admitting that level of expertise would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "Educated guesswork," she said finally. Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly. "That was some pretty sophisticated guesswork. Those calculations were dead-on accurate." Before Olivia could respond, Preston's voice cut across the natatorium like a starter's whistle. "Coach Morgan, if you're done socializing with the substitute staff, we're ready to begin the afternoon trials." The dismissal was pointed and rude, designed to put both Morgan and Olivia in their places. Morgan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she simply nodded and walked away without another word. The afternoon brought the most challenging swimming trials yet. Events were structured at maximum difficulty across strokes that would test every aspect of the swimmer's skills. Environmental conditions were marginal at best, with shifting water temperatures and variable currents that made accurate performance extremely difficult. Olivia watched from her isolated position as swimmer after swimmer struggled with the conditions. Times dropped, scores suffered, and frustration mounted with each failed attempt. The electronic monitoring equipment was providing data, but it wasn't capturing the subtle variations that were throwing off the calculations. She could see the problems clearly: circulation patterns at different depths, thermal layers from the heating system, pressure variations caused by the pool's unique architecture. These were conditions she'd learned to read through hard experience. In places where missing meant losing everything. But she was trapped behind her barriers, reduced to recording failures she could have prevented if anyone had been willing to listen. The breaking point came during Preston's star swimmer's attempt at a particularly challenging butterfly sequence. He'd been building up to this moment all day, talking about technique and precision while positioning himself as the undisputed master of the facility. The sequence required perfect calculation and flawless execution. Preston settled his swimmer into position with theatrical precision, taking longer than necessary to deliver last-minute instructions. The crowd gathered closer, whispers exchanging. As predictions were made about the outcome, Olivia could see the water pattern shifting across the lanes, creating conditions that would require significant technique modifications. The swimmer launched with powerful precision. A long minute passed in focused attention. Then the timing board flashed the result. 2 seconds too slow, nowhere near qualifying time. The silence that followed was deafening. Preston's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. He checked his notes furiously, looking for some technical explanation for the failure. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly. "How is anyone supposed to achieve qualifying times with defective environmental conditions?" His eyes found Olivia across the natatorium, and she felt the weight of his fury like a physical force. 3 days of useless readings, Preston continued, his voice rising. 3 days of incompetent substitute work that's making this entire program look like amateurs. The unfairness of the accusation hit Olivia like a slap. Her data had been accurate within the limits of her equipment. The problem wasn't her readings, it was the coach's inability to adapt to conditions. Their instruments couldn't measure. But the crowd was buying Preston's explanation. Heads were nodding, voices were murmuring agreement. She was the perfect scapegoat for their collective failure. "Maybe," Preston said with poisonous satisfaction, "it's time we got someone in that position who actually understands what real swimming requires." That's when something inside Olivia finally snapped, not into anger or outrage, but into a cold, calculating determination that she recognized from her most challenging competitions. The feeling was familiar and welcome, the moment when emotion fell away and pure tactical thinking took control. She stood up slowly, clipboard in hand, and walked toward the pool deck with measured steps. "Assistant Coach Preston," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the natatorium, "I believe there may be an issue with your stroke pattern." Calculations. The crowd turned to stare at her with a mixture of shock and amusement. The anonymous substitute was actually speaking up, actually challenging the facility's top coach in front of everyone. Preston's expression was pure predatory satisfaction. "Oh, really? And what makes you think you're qualified to comment on advanced swimming calculations?" Olivia met his stare without flinching. "Because your swimmer was compensating for a standard turbulence pattern, but the actual conditions in lane 4 were creating a counterclockwise vortex that shifted twice during the routine." The specificity of her analysis caught everyone off guard. This wasn't the generic protest of an offended substitute. This was technical precision that suggested deep understanding. Preston's smile became cruel. "Well then, if you're such an expert, maybe you'd like to demonstrate these superior skills." The challenge hung in the air like chlorine vapor. Olivia looked around the natatorium, seeing faces that ranged from curious to openly hostile. Coach Morgan was watching with sharp attention, her expression unreadable. "I don't think that would be appropriate," Olivia said carefully. "Oh, I think it would be very appropriate," Preston replied. "In fact, I insist. If you're going to criticize the performance of qualified personnel, you should be prepared to back up your criticism with action." The trap was obvious. If she declined, she'd be marked as all talk and no substance. If she accepted and failed, she'd be publicly humiliated and probably removed from her position entirely. If she accepted and succeeded, well, that would raise questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. But as she looked around the facility at the faces full of contempt and dismissal, Olivia realized she was tired of hiding. Tired of being invisible, tired of watching others fail at tasks she could perform in her sleep. "All right," she said quietly, "I'll take the challenge." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Laughter, disbelief, eager anticipation of her humiliation. Someone started to set up a standard training session, but Preston held up his hand. "No," he said with malicious glee. "If she's going to play with the big leagues, she should use big league equipment. He gestured toward his personal swimmer, a scholarship-bound senior whose times were approaching Olympic trial qualifying standards. The athlete was beautifully trained and perfectly conditioned, but Olivia could see he was set up specifically for Preston's coaching style and physical approach. "Assistant Coach Preston," Morgan interrupted. "That swimmer isn't properly prepared for what the lady wanted to demonstrate." Preston cut her off. "I'm just giving her the opportunity." Olivia walked toward the pool edge with steady steps, her mind already shifting into the cold calculation mode that had kept her motivated through dozens of impossible competitions. She could feel every eye in the natatorium watching her, could sense the mixture of anticipation and contempt that surrounded her like fog. As the swimmer looked at her questioningly, muscle memory older than her current assignment took control. The situation felt familiar despite its unfamiliar configuration, like a language she'd spoken fluently before learning to fear the consequences of her own fluency. Behind her, she heard Preston's voice carrying across the natatorium. "This should be entertaining." But Coach Morgan had gone very quiet, and her ice-blue eyes had taken on the sharp focus of someone who just recognized a predator in sheep's clothing. Olivia's hands closed around the stopwatch with practiced ease, and immediately she felt the subtle wrongness of the situation. The swimmer was trained for sprint performance, not technical demonstration. The stroke pattern was optimized for maximum power, not the efficiency needed for this particular challenge. These were obstacles that would challenge any coach, exactly what Preston had intended. But as she studied the athlete and felt her coaching instincts distribute across her consciousness, something fundamental shifted inside her. The clipboard carrying substitute began to fade, replaced by someone whose muscle memory had been forged in places these people couldn't imagine. "Take your time," Preston called out with false generosity. "No rush. We know this is probably your first time handling anything more complex than a permission slip." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, but Olivia barely heard it. Her attention had narrowed to the technical challenge before her. The swimmer was positioned at the starting block, ready to attempt the same butterfly sequence that had defeated Preston's coaching minutes earlier. Water conditions remained variable and complex, with thermal layers creating additional complications that the standard monitoring equipment couldn't detect. She stood beside the pool, beginning the process of adaptation that would allow her to work within the swimmer's limitations. Her movements were economical and precise, each adjustment calculated to maximize effectiveness despite the poor preparation. "Need help figuring out which end of the pool to watch?" Someone called from the crowd, drawing another wave of laughter. Olivia ignored the mockery, her focus entirely on the task ahead. She asked the swimmer a few quick questions about his training history, adjusted her expectations based on his responses, and began the mental calculations that would account for the athlete's specific stroke characteristics. Coach Morgan had moved closer to the pool edge, her expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching concern. Unlike the others, she seemed to recognize that Olivia's preparations were anything but amateur. Her movements had the fluid efficiency of someone who'd performed these tasks thousands of times under conditions far more stressful than a high school competition. "This is taking longer than I expected," Preston announced. Maybe she's having second thoughts about her bold claims. Olivia finally looked up from her preparations, meeting Preston's gaze with eyes that had gone cold and distant. "I'm ready." The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The apologetic substitute had been replaced by someone whose presence commanded attention. Several of the closer observers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the transformation without understanding its source. Olivia positioned herself at the perfect observation point, her body forming the stable platform that precision coaching demanded. The swimmer still wasn't ideally suited for the demonstration, but she'd adapted her approach to work within his constraints. Her breathing settled into the slow rhythm that would provide the foundation for accurate assessment. Through her practiced eye, The pool appeared as a complex dynamic system shimmering with potential, filled with challenges that would defeat the most experienced coach. Olivia studied the water through her trained perspective, noting the way current patterns distorted the surface and affected her timing estimation. But her real attention was focused on the environmental conditions that the crowd couldn't see. She watched water movement at different depths, noting their patterns across lanes. The way maintenance had affected the circulation system revealed water flows that her instruments couldn't measure from this distance. These were skills that couldn't be taught in any coaching manual, abilities developed through years of practical application in high-pressure environments where accuracy meant victory. Olivia synthesized the information with the unconscious ease of someone who'd learned to read water like others read books. The current patterns were complex but not chaotic. There was a rhythm to the water movement, a predictable cycle that repeated every 35 to 40 seconds. Surface currents running right to left at approximately 3 feet per second, with a thermal component creating vertical displacement near the turn wall. At mid-pool, a counterflow of cooler water would push the swimmer off course if not properly compensated. Olivia waited, her finger resting lightly on the stopwatch, feeling the pool's heartbeat through her consciousness. The crowd behind her had grown quiet, perhaps sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Any day now," Preston called out, but his voice carried less confidence than before. Olivia ignored him, her entire being focused on the swimmer and the conditions between his starting position and the finish line. She felt the water pattern beginning its cycle, watched surface tension shift direction, noted the way acoustics seemed to change with subtle variations in air temperature. The moment of opportunity came exactly when her experience told her it would. A brief window when all the variables aligned in the swimmer's favor. She gave him precise rapid-fire instructions about stroke modifications, breathing patterns, and turn technique. The crowd murmured in confusion as the swimmer listened with unexpected attention. Something in Olivia's tone or demeanor had cut through his initial skepticism. He nodded once, positioning himself on the starting block with renewed focus. Olivia raised her hand, gave the traditional ready signal, and triggered the stopwatch. With mechanical precision, the swimmer launched into the water with perfect form, his body cutting through the surface like a precision instrument. The modified stroke pattern Olivia had instructed looked strange to the untrained eye, slightly asymmetrical, with an unusual rhythm to the kicks. But as he progressed down the lane, it became apparent that something extraordinary was happening. His body was moving through the water with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural, finding invisible channels of least resistance that no one else had detected. The first turn was executed with textbook precision, but with subtle modifications that accounted for the thermal layer near the wall. The crowd watched in growing astonishment as the swimmer maintained perfect form through the second lap, his pace not just meeting but exceeding what should have been possible. Olivia stood motionless beside the pool, her experience telling her the performance was extraordinary, but knowing that confidence meant nothing until the timing board confirmed success or failure. The silence stretched across the natatorium like a held breath. Electronic equipment beeped softly as coaches checked their instruments. Stopwatches were raised to capture the impending finish. The crowd waited with the kind of tense anticipation that accompanied moments of truth. Then the swimmer's hand touched the wall, and the timing board flashed the result in glowing digital clarity. 3 seconds under qualifying time. A new school record. The silence that followed was deeper than before, heavy with disbelief and growing awareness that something unprecedented had just occurred. Olivia remained in position, her eyes still fixed on the timing display, watching the numbers that had made the challenge so impossible. She'd known the performance would be exceptional from the moment she'd given her instructions. The swimmer's ability, the water conditions, the modified technique, all had told her the time would be extraordinary. But confirmation still brought a familiar satisfaction, the quiet pride of a job done well under difficult circumstances. Behind her, she could hear voices beginning to stir, fragments of conversation that suggested the crowd was struggling to process what they'd witnessed. That was, did she? Impossible time. That's not luck. That's... Olivia turned gracefully from her position, her movements controlled and professional. She stopped the stopwatch, checked the time against the official board, and began the process of making notes for return to her assigned position. Her face showed no emotion, no sign of the satisfaction she felt at having silenced her critics so definitively. Preston was staring at her with an expression of stunned disbelief. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The cruel amusement had drained from his face, replaced by something approaching fear. "How?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia handed him the stopwatch with the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout the ordeal. "You were right about the conditions being challenging," she said quietly. "But your technique adjustments were based on surface readings only. You didn't account for the thermal layer at midpool or the pressure differential near the turn wall." The technical explanation was delivered in the same tone she might have used to discuss the weather, but its implications were staggering. This level of environmental analysis required years of advanced training and practical experience that few coaches ever achieved. Coach Morgan stepped forward, her ice blue eyes sharp with new understanding. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "might I ask where you received your coaching training?" The question hung in the air like mist from the pool surface. Olivia looked around the natatorium, seeing faces that had transformed from mockery to confusion to something approaching awe. These people were trying to reconcile the anonymous substitute they dismissed with the precision coach who just accomplished something they believed impossible. "Various assignments," Olivia replied, using the same non-answer she'd given before. But now the words carried different weight, suggested depths of experience that hadn't been apparent when she'd been hiding behind her clipboard. The sound of footsteps on tile announced the arrival of Principal Donovan, the administrator whose decision had relegated Olivia to her current assignment. He approached the pool deck with the measured pace of someone accustomed to authority. But his expression suggested he'd heard enough over the facility's communication system to know that something significant had occurred. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his gaze moving between Olivia and the assembled crowd. Preston struggled to find his voice. "Sir, the substitute just coached Jackson to a qualifying time, 3 seconds under the previous record." Donovan's eyes found Olivia, studying her with new attention. "Is that so?" The principal's tone was carefully neutral, but Olivia could see the calculations behind his eyes. He was a career administrator who'd survived and prospered by understanding the political currents that flowed through educational institutions. The fact that his temporary hire had just demonstrated world-class coaching skills was a development with potentially serious ramifications. "Just doing my job, sir," Olivia replied, her voice steady and professional. But they all knew that what had just happened went far beyond any job description for substitute personnel. The question now was what would happen next, and whether Olivia was prepared for the scrutiny that her demonstration of skill would inevitably bring. The afternoon sun continued streaming through the tall windows, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The easy camaraderie and casual mockery had been replaced by uncertain tension and growing questions that no one seemed prepared to answer. Olivia walked back toward her isolated station, clipboard in hand, leaving behind a crowd of people who were struggling to understand what they'd witnessed. But she could feel their eyes following her, could sense the conversations that would begin as soon as she was out of earshot. The game had changed. The question now was whether she was ready for what would come next. The morning of the 4th day brought changes that Olivia noticed immediately upon arriving at the natatorium. Her isolated station had been moved again, this time to a position where she had clear sight lines to most of the training activities. The supply cart that had blocked her view was gone, replaced by a simple table and chair positioned with full visibility of the pool deck. More significantly, there was a manila folder waiting on her table, thick, official-looking, and marked with university logos that made her stomach tighten with recognition. Someone had been busy overnight pulling records that weren't supposed to exist. Olivia sat down carefully, acutely aware that every movement was being observed. Assistant Coach Preston was already at his station, but he kept glancing in her direction, with an expression that mixed wariness with something approaching fear. The easy confidence that had defined his previous interactions with her was completely gone. Coach Morgan approached her table with 2 travel mugs of coffee, moving with the deliberate casualness of someone who wanted the interaction to appear accidental. She set 1 cup beside Olivia's folder without asking permission. "Thought you might need this," she said quietly. "Going to be a long day." Olivia accepted the coffee with a nod of gratitude, but her attention was focused on the folder. She recognized the university letterhead, the document format, the particular shade of blue that indicated personnel records from elite coaching divisions. Someone with significant clearance had been digging into her background. Interesting. Reading material, Morgan observed, settling into a chair beside her table without invitation. "I haven't opened it yet," Olivia replied honestly. "Might want to before Principal Donovan arrives. Word is he's bringing some friends from higher up the food chain." The warning was delivered in Morgan's characteristic direct tone, but Olivia could hear the underlying tension. Whatever was in that folder, it was significant enough to attract attention from well above the school level. Olivia opened the folder carefully, acutely aware that Morgan was watching her reaction with professional interest. The first document was a standard personnel summary, but even the unclassified portions told a story that would explain yesterday's demonstration. Former designation: Elite Performance Director, Olympic Development Program. Competitive achievements: 14 national champions, 7 Olympic qualifiers, 3 medal winners. Maximum performance improvement: 28% within single training cycle under challenging conditions. The summary was clinical and brief, but each line represented months or years of the most demanding work the sport had to offer. Olivia had hoped this information would remain buried, but apparently yesterday's demonstration had been impressive enough to prompt a serious investigation. "Olympic Development Program," Morgan said quietly, reading over her shoulder. "I thought that was just for show." Olivia looked up at her sharply. "You've heard the name?" "Heard stories. Coach who could make impossible improvements in athletes that traditional programs couldn't develop. Beijing, London, Rio, some locations that officially don't acknowledge special training. They called her the Water Whisperer." Morgan's ice blue eyes were studying Olivia's face with new respect. The story said Water Whisperer was a myth, someone who might not actually exist. "The stories were wrong about a lot of things," Olivia said carefully. Morgan nodded slowly, like the assumption that Water Whisperer was just a marketing gimmick. Before Olivia could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Principal Donovan and his promised reinforcements. 3 people entered the natatorium, radiating the kind of authority that commanded immediate attention. Olivia closed the folder and straightened in her chair, preparing for whatever was about to unfold. The easy anonymity of her substitute assignment was clearly over, replaced by scrutiny that would determine whether her career had any future at all. Principal Donovan approached with a woman in a tailored suit whose posture and bearing screamed National Sports Association, and a silver-haired man whose Olympic pins indicated a position that commanded serious respect throughout the swimming community. "Miss Foster," Principal Donovan said formally, using her name for the first time since her assignment began. "These individuals would like to speak with you about yesterday's demonstration." The woman stepped forward, her credentials already in hand. Catherine Reynolds, National Swimming Association Performance Division. This is Director Thomas Harrington, Olympic Committee Talent Development. We understand you made quite an impression at the pool yesterday. Olivia remained seated, her expression neutral. I provided coaching advice at the request of facility personnel. Coaching advice, Reynolds repeated. That resulted in a 3-second improvement and new school record. Using a swimmer unfamiliar with your methods. That's the kind of coaching that attracts attention. Ms. Foster, the silver-haired man interrupted. I believe we may have worked together previously, though under different circumstances. I'm Thomas Harrington, Olympic Committee Talent Development. I believe our paths crossed during the 2016 training cycle. Olivia studied Harrington's face, searching her memory for a connection. The name was familiar, but the context remained unclear. Too many competitions, too many officials, too many faces that had appeared and disappeared from her professional world. I'm sorry, Director, but I don't recall our paths crossing. Harrington smiled grimly. Operation Podium Pursuit, 4 years ago. You provided technique development for an extraction program where we pulled a potential medalist from a failing college program. We had 6 weeks to prepare her for trials in a location that officially never held specialized training. The memory clicked into place with uncomfortable clarity. Olivia remembered the assignment, a brilliant swimmer who'd been mismanaged by coaches who didn't understand her unique biomechanics. She'd been positioned as a consultant, providing guidance that had allowed the athlete to fight her way to qualification. I was part of a larger development team, Olivia said carefully. You were the only coach who could have made those improvements, Harrington replied. My after-action report specifically mentioned the precision of the technical adjustments. Performance improvement of 17% in a 6-week period, with significant psychological challenges. The athlete won bronze. Reynolds was taking notes, her pen scratching across a small notebook. Ms. Foster, your current assignment seems somewhat inconsistent with your apparent skill level. Olivia felt the weight of multiple gazes, aware that her next words would determine the direction of this conversation. Behind the officials, she could see facility personnel gathering at a respectful distance, clearly curious about the high-level attention their humble pool was receiving. I was reassigned to substitute duties following a program review, she said finally. The details are confidential under my previous contract. Harrington spoke again, his voice carrying the flat precision of someone accustomed to evaluation. Ms. Foster, we've reviewed your personnel file. The program you're referring to is Project Breakwater, correct? Olivia's stomach tightened. Breakwater had been the disaster that had ended her operational career. The program where politics and reality had collided with devastating consequences. Someone had thrown her under the bus to protect higher-level interests, and her protests had been buried under confidentiality agreements and bureaucratic maneuvering. I'm not authorized to discuss Project Breakwater, she replied. Actually, Reynolds interjected, you are. As of yesterday evening, your confidentiality restrictions have been fully waived, along with access to all program records related to your case. The news hit Olivia like a physical blow. For months, she'd been fighting through official channels to get her restrictions lifted, to gain access to the evidence that would vindicate her training methods. Every request had been denied, every appeal dismissed, every avenue of redress blocked by administrative stonewalling. I don't understand, she said quietly. Harrington leaned forward slightly. Yesterday's demonstration raised some questions about the circumstances of your reassignment. When we started pulling files, we discovered some inconsistencies in the official reports. What kind of inconsistencies? Reynolds opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with confidentiality stamps that indicated serious proprietary material. The kind that suggests someone went to considerable effort to bury the truth about what really happened during Breakwater. Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the folder. Inside were documents she'd never seen before, performance analyses, medical reports, psychological evaluations that painted a picture very different from the one that had destroyed her career. The program had been compromised from the beginning. Administrative failures, political interference, and management decisions that had prioritized publicity over athlete development. Olivia's methods hadn't caused the program failure. They prevented a complete disaster that would have destroyed several promising careers. This evidence has been available all along? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hidden, Harrington corrected. Someone with significant influence made sure these files never saw the light of day. Someone who needed a scapegoat to cover their own failures. Olivia felt a cold rage building in her chest, the kind of fury that had nothing to do with emotion, and everything to do with justice delayed and denied. She'd spent months believing that she'd failed, that her methods had compromised a program and endangered athletic careers. The truth was exactly the opposite. Who? She asked. Reynolds and Harrington exchanged glances, a silent communication that suggested they'd reached the crucial moment of this conversation. That's what we're here to find out, Reynolds said. But we need your help. We need someone who understands the program details. Someone who can help us identify the people responsible for burying this evidence. Olivia looked around the natatorium, seeing familiar faces that now carried different meanings. Assistant Coach Preston was watching from a distance, his expression suggesting he was beginning to understand that his casual mockery had targeted someone far more dangerous than he'd realized. Coach Morgan caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of support from someone who understood the weight of what was being revealed. These were career coaches who recognized injustice when they saw it, who understood that what had happened to Olivia could happen to any of them. What exactly are you proposing? Olivia asked. Full investigation, Harrington replied. Complete. Review of Project Breakwater and the subsequent cover-up. Identification and sanctioning of everyone involved in burying the evidence. And in return, full reinstatement to your previous position and credentials, complete vindication of your methods, and the opportunity to help ensure this never happens to anyone else. Olivia closed the folder carefully, her mind racing through the implications of what was being offered. Justice, vindication, and the chance to return to the work she'd been born to do, but also exposure, scrutiny, and the inevitable consequences of challenging people with the power to destroy careers. I need time to consider this, she said. Finally, Reynolds nodded. You have until tomorrow morning. But Ms. Foster. She paused, her expression growing serious. The people who did this to you are still in positions of power. Every day we delay gives them more time to cover their tracks. As the officials departed, leaving Olivia alone with her thoughts and a folder full of vindication, she felt the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders. The safe path would be to decline, to remain invisible in her substitute role, to avoid the risks that came with challenging institutional power. But as she looked across the natatorium where she'd been humiliated and dismissed, where her expertise had been mocked and her contributions ignored, Olivia felt the fire that had made her legendary beginning to burn with renewed intensity. They'd tried to bury her. They'd tried to erase her contributions and hide their own failures behind her destroyed reputation. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether she was ready to fight back. Olivia didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small apartment going through the declassified files, each document adding another piece to a puzzle that revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed her career. By morning, her decision was made. She arrived at the facility early, before the first scheduled training session, carrying herself with a confidence that had been absent since her reassignment. The change was subtle but unmistakable, the way she walked, the set of her shoulders, the direct way she met people's eyes. The apologetic substitute was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Reynolds and Harrington were waiting at her table, along with a new face, a man in a crisp suit whose bearing suggested serious legal authority. "Miss Foster," Harrington said as Olivia approached. "This is Marcus Bennett, Chief Counsel for the National Sports Ethics Commission. He'll be handling the legal aspects of our investigation." Olivia shook hands with the lawyer, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that suggested someone accustomed to high-stakes litigation. "I've reviewed your case file," Bennett said without preamble. "What was done to you represents one of the most egregious examples of institutional cover-up I've encountered in 15 years of sports law." "And you believe we can prove it? With your cooperation?" "Yes, the evidence is strong, but we need someone with program knowledge to help us connect the dots." Olivia looked around the natatorium, noting that several key personnel had arrived early and were watching the proceedings with obvious interest. Assistant Coach Preston stood near the equipment room, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy that suggested he understood the significance of the morning's gathering. "What exactly do you need from me?" Olivia asked. Reynolds opened a briefcase and withdrew a digital tablet loaded with files and photographs. "We need you to walk us through Project Breakwater from your perspective. Every detail, every decision, every communication. We need to understand how the official reports differ from what actually happened." Olivia accepted the tablet and began scrolling through program documents she hadn't seen in months. The memories came flooding back, the impossible timeline, the inadequate support, the political pressure that had forced development decisions based on publicity rather than athletic reality. "The program was doomed from the start," she said quietly. "The selection process was rushed. The facilities analysis was incomplete, and the development timeline was impossible given the known physiological constraints. But you went ahead." "Anyway," Bennett observed, "orders are orders. But I modified my approach to provide better results than the original plan called for. That modification saved the program." "According to your original reports," Reynolds said, consulting her notes. "But the official review blamed your methodology changes for compromising athlete performance." Olivia's jaw tightened as she remembered the betrayal of that review. "My methodology changes allowed me to develop 6 athletes who would have been eliminated from the program. Without that intervention, we would have lost 12 potential international competitors instead of 3. "3? Harrington looked up sharply. "The official reports list 8 performance failures." 3, Olivia confirmed. "Williams, Martinez, and Chun were the only true physiological non-responders, both from genetic factors that occurred before my involvement began. The other 5 names on the failure report were added later." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Inflating failure figures was a serious ethical breach, one that suggested the cover-up went deeper than simple scapegoating. Bennett was typing rapidly on his own tablet, recording every word. "Miss Foster, do you have any theory about why someone would inflate the failure figures?" "Political cover," Olivia replied without hesitation. "Someone needed a disaster to justify their earlier decisions. A program with 3 non-responders isn't a disaster. It's an acceptable outcome given the circumstances. But 8 failures suggests methodological error that requires investigation. An investigation would have revealed the administrative failures and political interference that set the program up for failure," Harrington concluded. "Exactly. So they created a narrative where the program failed because of coaching error, specifically my failure to follow the approved methodology." Reynolds leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "Miss Foster, what you're describing isn't just career assassination. It's potential fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal statutes regarding false statements to governmental bodies." Before Olivia could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Principal Donovan. He walked across the natatorium with measured steps, but his expression suggested someone facing an uncomfortable conversation. "Director Harrington," he said formally, I understand you're conducting interviews regarding personnel assignments. Among other things, the director replied coolly. Principal, we need to discuss Miss Foster's original reassignment to your facility. Donovan's face went carefully neutral. That assignment came through normal administrative channels. A routine. Personnel transfer based on district requirements. Routine. Reynolds looked up from her notes. Principal, Miss Foster was transferred to your facility with administrative restrictions that effectively ended her coaching career. That seems excessive for a routine reassignment. I was following directives from higher authority, Donovan replied, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. Whose directives? Bennett asked, his pen poised over his legal pad. The question hung in the air like mist. From the pool. Principal Donovan looked around the natatorium, noting the gathered personnel who were watching the exchange with obvious interest. His position was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of the investigation became clear. I'd prefer to discuss this in a more private setting, he said finally. I'm sure you would, Harrington replied. But Miss Foster has the right to hear the answers to these questions. After all, they concern her career and reputation. Donovan's gaze found Olivia, and she saw something there that might have been regret, or possibly fear. Miss Foster, I want you to know that your assignment here wasn't personal. I was told you needed a cooling-off period after a program that had gone badly. Told by whom? Reynolds pressed. Deputy Director of Athletics for Regional Development, James Wilson. He called personally to ensure the transfer was handled with appropriate discretion. The name hit Olivia like a physical blow. Wilson had been one of the officials who'd pushed for Project Breakwater, despite the obvious methodological problems. He'd been present at the briefings where coaches had raised concerns about the program timeline and physiological assessment. Wilson, she said quietly. He was the one who overruled our request for additional development time. Bennett looked up sharply. You're saying that the same official who helped create the conditions for program failure was the one who arranged your punishment for that failure? That's exactly what I'm saying. Harrington turned to Principal Donovan with an expression that could have frozen pool water. Principal, did Director Wilson provide any specific guidance about Miss Foster's assignment restrictions? Donovan shifted uncomfortably. He emphasized that she should be kept away from coaching duties until a full review could be completed. He said there were concerns about her methodology and reliability. Based on what evidence? Reynolds asked. I assume the evidence was in her personnel file. Her personnel file shows nothing but commendations and successful program completions, Bennett said coldly. What you're describing sounds like character assassination based on false information. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Coach Morgan, who approached the group with obvious urgency. Director Harrington, she said formally. I believe there's something you should know about yesterday's demonstration. What about it, Coach? Morgan glanced at Olivia, then back to the director. Sir, I've been thinking about the performance improvement she created. 3 seconds, unfamiliar athlete, challenging conditions. That's not just good coaching. That's world-class development. Your point, Coach. My point is that someone with those skills doesn't develop methodology problems overnight. And someone with that level of training doesn't get assigned to substitute duties without a very specific reason. Harrington nodded slowly. Coach Morgan, would you be willing to provide a written statement about Miss Foster's demonstrated capabilities? Yes, sir. And I believe several other facility personnel would be willing to do the same. Olivia looked around the natatorium, seeing faces that had changed from mockery to respect over the past few days. These were professional coaches who recognized injustice when they saw it, who understood that what had happened to her could happen to any of them. Assistant Coach Preston approached the group hesitantly, his earlier confidence completely gone. Director Harrington, sir, I'd like To apologize to Miss Foster for my behavior over the past few days. Olivia met his gaze steadily. Apology accepted, assistant coach. You were working with incomplete information. That's no excuse for unprofessional conduct, Preston replied. I should have recognized. I mean, someone with your skills shouldn't have been assigned to substitute duties. Which brings us back to the question of why that assignment was made, Harrington finished. Reynolds closed her notebook and looked around the assembled group. I think we have enough to move forward with formal proceedings. Miss Foster, are you prepared to testify about Project Breakwater and its aftermath? Olivia stood up slowly, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She looked across the natatorium where she'd been humiliated and dismissed, where her expertise had been mocked and her contributions ignored. Then she thought about all the other coaches who might face similar treatment if this conspiracy was allowed to continue. Yes, she said firmly. I'm ready to testify. The words seemed to echo across the aquatic facility, carrying with them the promise of justice, long delayed but finally within reach. The hearing room in the National Swimming Association headquarters was nothing like the high school natatorium, where this story had begun. Polished mahogany replaced chlorine-scented tile, conference tables substituted for starting blocks, and the controlled atmosphere bore no resemblance to the challenging pool conditions that had started everything. But for Olivia, walking into that room felt like preparing for the most important race of her career. 4 weeks had passed since her conversation with Harrington and the investigators. 4 weeks of intensive preparation, document review, and testimony coaching. Now she sat at the witness table facing a panel of senior officials whose decisions would determine not just her future, but the accountability of those who had destroyed her career. The panel was impressive and intimidating in equal measure. The chair of the National Swimming Ethics Committee presided over proceedings that included representatives from multiple agencies and oversight bodies. The association president himself was present, along with officials whose titles and credentials suggested this investigation had reached the highest levels of the sport. Across the room, Olivia could see Deputy Director James Wilson, the man whose phone call had banished her to substitute purgatory. He sat with his legal team, projecting the confidence of someone who believed his position made him untouchable. Marcus Bennett, the Ethics Commission counsel, rose to begin his presentation. Over the past weeks, he'd become more than Olivia's legal representative. He'd become an advocate for institutional accountability that transcended any individual. Case, ladies and gentlemen, Bennett began. What we will demonstrate today is a systematic conspiracy to cover up administrative failures and program mismanagement by destroying the career of an exemplary coach who threatened to expose the truth. He activated a wall display showing Project Breakwater parameters, comparing the official briefing materials with physiological data that had been available but ignored. Project Breakwater was doomed from conception, rushed athlete selection, political pressure to meet unrealistic timelines, and management decisions that prioritize publicity over performance development. When the program encountered problems that should have been anticipated, those responsible needed a scapegoat. Olivia watched the faces of the panel members as Bennett walked them through the evidence. Some showed obvious anger at what was being revealed. Others maintained careful neutrality that suggested they were still evaluating the allegations. Miss Foster, Bennett continued, was chosen as that scapegoat because her modifications to the program methodology, modifications that saved the program, provided a convenient excuse for those who had created the conditions for failure. The ethics chair leaned forward slightly. Mr. Bennett, these are serious allegations. I trust you have evidence to support them. Extensive evidence. Madam Chair, including communications that were deliberately excluded from the original investigation. Bennett activated another display showing email exchanges between Wilson and other officials in the days following Project Breakwater's conclusion. The messages revealed a coordinated effort to control the narrative and ensure that blame fell on coaching personnel rather than management decisions. Olivia felt her stomach tighten as she read the callous language used to discuss her career destruction. To these officials, she hadn't been a person with years of dedicated service. She'd been a problem to be managed, a potential threat to be neutralized. "Mr. Wilson," the chair said, turning to face the deputy director, "do you recognize these communications?" Wilson consulted briefly with his attorney before responding. "Madam Chair, I don't recall the specific details of these exchanges." The period following Project Breakwater was chaotic, with multiple evaluations and reviews underway simultaneously. "You don't recall personally calling Principal Donovan to arrange Miss Foster's administrative reassignment?" "As I said, Madam Chair, there were multiple personnel actions during that period. I can't be expected to remember every conversation." Olivia felt a flash of cold anger at the casual dismissal. These were the same evasion tactics she'd encountered for months, plausible deniability wrapped in bureaucratic doublespeak. The ethics chair's expression suggested she was equally unimpressed with Wilson's convenient memory loss. "Ms. Foster, you've heard Mr. Wilson's testimony. Do you have anything to add?" Olivia stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was her chance, not just for personal vindication, but to ensure accountability for those who'd abused their power. "Madam Chair, 4 weeks ago, I was sitting on a folding chair in a high school pool, being mocked by students who assumed I was incompetent support staff. That assignment was an accident or routine personnel management. It was punishment designed to destroy my career and silence my knowledge of what really happened during Project Breakwater." She gestured toward the evidence displays, her voice carrying the controlled intensity that had once made her legendary in coaching communities. "Mr. Wilson didn't just arrange my reassignment. He orchestrated a campaign to ensure I could never challenge the false narrative that protected his reputation. When I tried to provide accurate testimony about the program, my statements were classified as confidential. When I requested access to program records, those requests were denied. When I sought legal representation, I was told the matter was close to further review." Olivia paused, letting the weight of those revelations settle on the room. But Mr. Wilson made one critical error. He assumed that burying me in substitute duties would keep me silent permanently. He never considered that eventually someone would notice that the woman they were mocking could create performance improvements that few people in the world are capable of achieving. The ethics chair nodded slowly. "Miss Foster, in your professional opinion, what would have happened if you hadn't modified your methodology during Project Breakwater?" "Complete program failure, Madam Chair. We would have lost 12 potential international competitors instead of 3. My methodology changes allowed me to develop athletes who were unsuited for the standard approach, and this methodology change was the basis for the negative evaluation that destroyed your career." "Yes, Madam Chair, they claimed I violated program parameters and compromised athlete development. The truth is exactly the opposite." Wilson's attorney requested permission to cross-examine, but his questions only reinforced the strength of Olivia's testimony. Every answer she gave was precise, detailed, and supported by evidence that painted a picture of institutional betrayal that grew more damning by the minute. The final blow came when Bennett introduced testimony from Coach Morgan and other facility personnel who had witnessed Olivia's demonstration. Their statements established beyond doubt that someone with her capabilities could never have been legitimately assigned to substitute duties based on performance concerns. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bennett concluded, "what we have here is clear evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of power at the highest levels. Miss Foster's career was destroyed not because of any failure on her part, but because she represented a threat to those who had failed in their duties." The ethics chair called for a brief recess, during which Olivia found herself surrounded by panel members and officials who wanted to express their support and outrage at what had been revealed. When proceedings resumed, the chair's expression was grim. After reviewing the evidence presented today, this panel finds clear and convincing proof of misconduct by officials charged with maintaining the integrity of our development systems. Mr. Wilson, you are hereby relieved of your duties pending formal ethical investigation. Additional personnel actions will follow as this investigation expands. Olivia felt a wave of vindication and relief that was almost overwhelming. Justice, so long delayed, was finally being served. But the ethics chair wasn't finished. Miss Foster, this panel owes you an apology on behalf of the institution that failed you. Your coaching record speaks for itself, and the injustice you've endured is a stain on all of us. She paused, consulting notes before continuing. Effective immediately, you are restored to your previous position and credentials. All negative evaluations related to Project Breakwater are expunged from your record. Additionally, you are being awarded the Association's Medal of Excellence for your contributions to athlete development, contributions that saved careers despite the negligence of those charged with supporting you. The room erupted in applause, but Olivia barely heard it. She was thinking about the high school natatorium where this journey had begun, about the people who had mocked her ignorance while remaining ignorant themselves of what they were witnessing. Furthermore, the chair continued, you are being offered assignment to the National Elite Development Program, where your expertise can be used to train the next generation of championship coaches. Olivia stood at attention, feeling the weight of vindication and new responsibility settling on her shoulders. Thank you, Madam Chair, I accept. As the hearing concluded and officials began filing out, Olivia found herself approached by Director Harrington. How does it feel? The director asked. Olivia considered the question carefully. Like justice, Director. Long delayed, but justice nonetheless. Any regrets about fighting back? Olivia thought about the past weeks, the investigation, the testimony, the personal cost of challenging institutional power. Then she thought about the other coaches who might face similar treatment if this kind of conspiracy was allowed to continue. None at all, Director. Someone had to stand up to them. Harrington smiled. Water Whisperer isn't just a nickname, is it? It's a statement of principle. Olivia returned the smile, feeling lighter than she had in months. Yes, sir. It is. As she walked out of the headquarters and into the afternoon sunlight, Olivia felt the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The coaching demonstration that had started everything, that display of skill in a high school natatorium, had led to accountability that reached the highest levels of the sport. But more than that, it had led to the restoration of her true identity. She was no longer the anonymous substitute with a clipboard. She was the Water Whisperer, and she was back where she belonged. 6 months later, Olivia stood at the edge of a different kind of pool. Not the humble high school facility where her resurrection had begun, but the pristine training grounds of the National Elite Development Program. The Olympic Training Center rose around her like a temple to athletic excellence, and the morning air carried the familiar scent of chlorine that had become the perfume of her redemption. Coach, the new class is ready for orientation, reported assistant coach Jennifer Walsh, her newly assigned development specialist. Walsh was young, eager, and possessed of the kind of natural talent that reminded Olivia of herself 15 years ago. Olivia nodded, checking her watch. The morning session would begin with 12 students, all experienced coaches, all convinced they understood the limits of performance development, all about to discover they had much to learn. How do they look, Walsh? Confident, the younger woman replied with a slight smile. Maybe too confident. Olivia returned the smile. Perfect. Confidence needs to be earned, not assumed. She walked toward the classroom building, her steps purposeful and sure. The intervening months had transformed more than just her assignment. They had restored her sense of purpose and professional identity. The woman who had once sat behind a clipboard, absorbing mockery and blame, was gone forever. The scandal that had followed her testimony had reached deep into the swimming establishment. Wilson was facing ethics charges for conspiracy and fraud. 3 other officials had been relieved of duty pending investigation. The entire system for handling program reviews had been overhauled to prevent future cover-ups. Most importantly, for Olivia, the truth about Project Breakwater had been fully revealed. The families of the athletes now knew their loved ones had struggled due to selection failures and political pressure, not coaching error. The successful participants had been properly recognized, and the lessons learned had been incorporated into training protocols that would develop champions in future programs. But personal vindication, satisfying as it was, had proven less important than the opportunity to pass on her knowledge to the next generation. Teaching was different from direct coaching, but no less challenging and far more rewarding than she'd expected. Olivia entered the classroom to find 12 coaches seated at attention, 8 men and 4 women, all wearing the kind of quiet confidence that came from proven ability at the regional level. She recognized some of the faces from competition reports, others from their growing reputations in developmental communities. "Good morning," she said simply, taking her position at the front of the room. "I'm Director Olivia Foster, but for the next 8 weeks, you can call me Coach Whisperer." A few eyebrows raised at the nickname reference, but no one spoke. They'd all heard the stories by now, the legendary developer who disappeared into administrative obscurity only to emerge and take down a conspiracy that reached the association's highest levels. "Before we begin," Olivia continued, "I want to address what some of you are thinking. Yes, I'm the person who created that performance improvement in the high school demonstration. Yes, I was the one they called Water Whisperer. And yes, I spent several months getting my career destroyed by people who value politics over truth." She paused, letting that sink in. "But none of that matters here. What matters is what you're going to learn over the next 8 weeks, and whether you're prepared to challenge everything you think you know about performance development." Olivia activated a wall display showing performance metrics at various levels and environmental conditions. Unlike the sterile charts used in most training facilities, these were real-world analyses from actual competitions, real improvements, taken under challenging conditions where precision meant opportunity. "Advanced coaching isn't about equipment or technique," she said, gesturing to the images. "It's about developing the mental discipline to perform under conditions that would break most people. It's about reading athletes that your instruments can't measure. It's about creating improvements that theory says are impossible." One of the students, a young man whose record showed exceptional promise, raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's the largest improvement you've ever created?" Olivia studied his face, seeing the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that she remembered from her own early training. 28%, she replied. "Challenging conditions, limited time frame, single development opportunity." But that's not the important question. What is the important question? The important question is whether you're prepared to develop the skills that would allow you to create that improvement if your athlete required it. She clicked to the next slide, showing environmental data from the high school natatorium where her public revelation had begun. 6 months ago, I was sitting behind a desk being dismissed as incompetent support staff by people who had never faced real pressure. They assumed that because I was quiet and unassuming, I must be weak. They were wrong. Olivia's voice carried the quiet intensity that had once made her legendary in coaching communities. Over the next 8 weeks, you're going to learn that true strength doesn't come from bravado or posturing. It comes from the quiet confidence that develops when you've mastered yourself as completely as you've mastered your methodology. The morning progressed with assessments and baseline evaluations that established each student's current capability. Olivia moved among them with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in her environment, offering advice that was precise, practical, and immediately effective. During the lunch break, she found herself approached by Coach Sarah Mitchell, one of the 4 women in the class, and someone whose development record suggested exceptional potential. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, "I wanted to thank you for what you did, taking on the association, exposing the cover-up. That took courage that most of us can't imagine." Olivia considered the comment carefully. "Coach, courage isn't about taking on institutions or fighting conspiracies. Courage is about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. But you got justice in the end." "I got vindication," Olivia corrected. "Justice would have been preventing the injustice in the first place. But sometimes vindication is the best we can manage." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you're teaching now? To prevent future injustices?" "I'm teaching because knowledge is meant to be shared. Because the techniques that kept me successful through dozens of impossible challenges shouldn't die with me. Because somewhere out there is another coach who's going to face conditions that will test every limit of their training." Olivia paused, looking across the facility where her students were preparing for the afternoon session. "When that moment comes, I want them to have every possible advantage. I want their athletes to reach their potential, and I want them to know that someone believed in their ability enough to share the hardest-earned lessons of a lifetime." The afternoon session took the students to the advanced pool where performance metrics were positioned at standards that would challenge their preconceptions about what was possible. Olivia watched them work, noting the subtle signs that separated the merely competent from the potentially exceptional. "Elite development isn't about equipment or facilities," she called out as they struggled with the challenging conditions. "It's about patience, observation, and the willingness to wait for the perfect moment, rather than forcing an imperfect approach." She demonstrated with her own athlete, not a borrowed swimmer like the one that had started her journey back to respectability, but her personal development protege who had been assigned along with her reinstated credentials. The students watched in silence as she settled into coaching with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed these movements thousands of times. The improvement when it came was perfect, not because of superior equipment or favorable conditions, but because Olivia had learned to read variables that others couldn't perceive and to execute under pressure that would paralyze most coaches. "How?" asked the young man who had questioned her earlier. Olivia stood gracefully, saving her notes with practiced efficiency. "Practice, 10,000 hours of practice under conditions that would make today's session feel like a vacation." "But the technique can be taught," Olivia interrupted. "Instinct cannot. Instinct comes from surviving situations where perfect technique isn't enough, where you have to adapt and improvise and somehow find a way to make the impossible. Improvement." She looked around at the assembled students, seeing faces that reflected varying degrees of understanding and ambition. "Some of you will develop that instinct. Others will become excellent technical coaches who perform well under controlled conditions. Both paths have value, but only one will prepare you for the moments when everything depends on a single performance." As the day concluded and equipment was secured, Olivia found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this place. The humiliation and betrayal seemed like distant memories now, replaced by the satisfaction of meaningful work and restored purpose. Assistant Coach Preston appeared as she was locking her equipment case. The man who had once mocked her ignorance now approached with obvious respect and something that might have been embarrassment. "Ma'am," he said formally, "I wanted to apologize again for my behavior at the high school facility." Olivia looked at him steadily. "Assistant Coach, you've apologized sufficiently. What matters now is what you learned from the experience." "I learned not to make assumptions about people based on appearances or assignments." "Good lesson, but there's a deeper one." Preston frowned. "Ma'am, the deeper lesson is about institutional culture and how it can blind us to injustice. You didn't mock me because you're a bad person. You mocked me because the system had created an environment where that behavior seemed acceptable. Olivia closed her case and turned to face him fully. The real test isn't whether you apologize for past behavior. The real test is whether you'll speak up when you see someone else being treated unfairly, even if that person can't defend themselves. Preston nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, I understand. I hope you do, assistant coach, because the next person who needs defending might not have the skills to eventually prove their worth. They might just be destroyed by the experience. As Preston walked away, Olivia felt the satisfaction of a lesson taught and hopefully learned. Individual accountability was important, but systemic change required people to recognize their role in perpetuating injustice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Coach Morgan, who had become something of a mentor and friend over the intervening months. Saw the news about your promotion to national director. Well deserved. When do you start the new assignment? Olivia smiled as she typed her response. Next month. Olympic Committee wants me to head up a new program for advanced performance analysis. Apparently, they think there's value in training coaches to read athletes that instruments can't measure. Morgan's reply came quickly. About time they figured that out. Water Whisperer is officially back in business. Olivia looked across the facility one final time before heading to her vehicle. The Olympic rings rose above her like ancient symbols, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold that reminded her of better times and brighter futures. She was no longer the woman who had sat behind a clipboard absorbing mockery and injustice while her expertise was dismissed and her contributions ignored. She was no longer the scapegoat for other people's failures or the victim of institutional conspiracy. She was Director Olivia Foster, soon to be National Director Foster, teacher of the impossible and master of the art that had defined her life. She was the Water Whisperer, and she had found her way home. The drive back to her quarters took her past the honor wall where the names of champion developers were engraved in gleaming metal. She stopped as she always did to pay her respects to those who had built the foundation she now stood upon. Among them were mentors and colleagues who had supported her journey, not the inflated failure list that had been used to destroy her career. Standing before their names, Olivia felt the weight of responsibility that came with survival and vindication. She had been given a second chance, an opportunity to use her skills and knowledge in service of those who would follow. She intended to make the most of it. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as she finally reached her quarters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to pass on the lessons that had cost her so much to learn. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Olivia felt complete. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The woman who had once been dismissed as incompetent support staff was now recognized as one of the most skilled developers in the sport. The conspiracy that had tried to bury her had been exposed and destroyed. The officials who had abused their power were facing the consequences of their actions. And somewhere in the Olympic Training Center, 12 coaches were learning that true excellence came not from equipment or technique, but from the patient development of skills that could mean the difference between mediocrity and championship. Performance, justice had been served. Purpose had been restored. And the Water Whisperer was back where she belonged, not hidden behind a clipboard or buried in administrative obscurity, but standing proudly in the light, sharing the powerful knowledge that made champions out of those brave enough to master it. The high school natatorium where her journey had begun seemed like a lifetime ago, but the lessons learned there about courage, persistence, and the price of truth would guide her for the rest of her career. Olivia Foster had found her way home, and she intended to make sure that no one else would ever face the journey she had been forced to make alone. The story that had begun with mockery and dismissal had ended with vindication and purpose. And in the morning, it would begin again with new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that excellence properly applied could overcome any obstacle. The water whisperer was back in business, and the legend would continue. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.